The mysterious arrival. The wind howled across the barren, rocky plains of the planet. A toxic atmosphere surrounded the lifeless world, making it almost impossible for anything to survive. This was a place where only the toughest creatures could live, and even they struggled. The aliens who once called this planet their home had long abandoned it, fleeing to more hospitable worlds. The planet was known as a Deathworld, a place where the land itself seemed to want to kill anything that dared to exist. But today, something unusual was happening, something that none of the aliens watching from their hidden stations could believe. A human had arrived. The first sighting came through the alien surveillance systems. A small, lone figure appeared on the edge of the deadly landscape. His clothing was simple, nothing special. No high-tech armor, no advanced tools. Just a man, walking steadily forward, stepping onto the harsh ground with confidence. It was strange. The humans they had observed in the past had never come to this planet. It was too dangerous for them, and every alien knew that. But this one was different. The aliens couldn't understand it. How was he still alive? Their scans showed that the humans' life signs were stable, but the environment was hostile to any form of life. The wind alone could tear through the toughest materials, and the air was filled with deadly gases. The heat from the planet's core radiated from below, threatening to burn everything that dared to touch the ground. And yet the human was still walking, unbothered by the surroundings. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Zorath, the leader of the alien monitoring team. His tentacles twitched in frustration as he stared at the images on the screen. "We need to find out who this human is, and why he's here." Zorath turned to his second-in-command, Thylor, a tall, thin alien with a smooth, silvery complexion. "Prepare a scout team. I want eyes on him now. We need to know what he's doing here." Thylor nodded, his expression full of concern. "But, Zorath, this planet is death. Not even our toughest soldiers can survive more than a few hours here. Are you sure we should send anyone to check on him? What if he's—" Zorath cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I'm aware of the risks, Thylor. But if he's truly out here, we need to know why. No human should be able to survive this. Get the team ready. We need answers." As the alien scout team prepared to leave, they couldn't help but stare at the images of the lone human in disbelief. The man was walking through the most dangerous terrain, completely unaware of the danger. His movements were steady, each step deliberate, as though he had been to places like this before. Why would he come here? Thylor murmured, more to himself than anyone else. No one would choose to come to this planet unless they had a reason. But what reason could a human possibly have? Meanwhile, the human walked on, unaware of the alien's presence. He didn't seem to be afraid. His face, though hidden by a helmet, showed no signs of worry or fear. The air was thick with poisonous gases, but he didn't seem to mind. He continued to walk, moving toward the mountains in the distance. He stopped for a moment to look around, as if taking in the alien landscape, and then continued on his way. He seemed perfectly at ease, as if the dangerous world around him was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The aliens watching from their base felt a strange chill down their spines. They had never seen a human act this way before. Zorath, sitting in the control room with his team, watched the human's every move. He was impressed, yet confused. There was something unsettling about this human, something that didn't fit with what they knew about Earthlings. "He's not like the other humans we've encountered," Zorath muttered. "Most humans are weak, fragile. But this one, there's something different about him." The scout team was ready now. With equipment designed to withstand the harsh elements, they prepared to leave the safety of the base and track the human. As they stepped out, the full force of the planet's violent winds hit them. Their suits hissed and groaned under the pressure, but they pressed on. They had one mission: to find out who this human was and what his intentions were. The group moved silently through the jagged terrain, carefully watching the human from a distance. They made sure to stay hidden behind rocks and cliffs, avoiding detection. The human hadn't noticed them yet, But Zoreth knew that would not last forever. Soon, they would need to confront him. But what would they say? What would they do? At this point, Zoreth wasn't sure what to expect. All he knew was that the human had made it this far, and there had to be a reason for it. What kind of person was he? Was he just another survivor, like the countless others who had died here? Or was he something else entirely? As the scout team moved closer, the human continued his journey toward the mountains, seemingly unaffected by the dangers around him. The aliens could only watch in awe and disbelief, knowing that something big was about to happen. Whatever the human's purpose was, it had only just begun. The shelter begins. The human continued his walk, ignoring the harsh winds that swept across the planet. His steps were steady, almost purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was going. The air was thick with toxic gases, the ground beneath him cracked and shifting, but none of this seemed to bother him. The alien team watched in silence, still trying to comprehend how the human had managed to survive this long on a death world. They had seen many species attempt to survive on hostile planets, but never had they encountered a human so calm, so unaffected. "He's still moving," Siler said, his voice filled with disbelief. "He hasn't even stopped for a break." Zoreth's eyes narrowed as he studied the screens. The human had reached a spot that seemed less dangerous, a rocky outcrop near a small ravine. The alien team had been tracking his movements for hours, and they knew it was only a matter of time before he would need shelter. But to their surprise, the human wasn't stopping to rest. Instead, he dropped to his knees and began to work. With quick, skilled movements, he started gathering rocks and materials from the surrounding area. "What is he doing?" Siler asked, watching with growing curiosity. Zoreth didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on the human's actions. The human wasn't just collecting random stones. He was building something. Slowly, piece by piece, he started to construct a structure, his movements quick and precise. "Is he building a shelter?" Siler asked, his voice filled with awe. Zoreth's eyes widened. The human was indeed building a shelter, but it wasn't just any shelter. It was designed to protect against the deadly conditions of the planet. He had somehow figured out exactly what was needed to survive here, even though he had only just arrived. The alien team knew the dangers of this world better than anyone. The winds could tear apart even the strongest materials. The ground was unstable, and the air could suffocate you in minutes. No species, not even the toughest ones, could survive for long without proper protection. But this human, he was doing something none of them had thought possible. In less than an hour, he had built a small, sturdy structure that could withstand the planet's harsh elements. "I've never seen anything like this," Siler whispered. "How is he doing this? How does he know how to survive here?" Zoreth was silent, deep in thought. He had watched countless species struggle and fail on this planet, but this human was different. He had no advanced technology. He wasn't using any fancy equipment. All he had were his hands, and with them, he was turning this hostile world into a place where he could survive. "Continue monitoring him," Zoreth said, finally breaking the silence. "We need to see if he can finish the shelter. We need to know what he's really capable of." The alien team was still in shock, watching as the human worked. The shelter was taking shape, and with each new piece of the structure, it became more and more impressive. It was clear that the human had experience with survival, but where had he learned these skills? How had he managed to adapt so quickly to such a deadly environment? As the human worked, his movements were calm and steady, as if he were at home in this dangerous world. The alien team couldn't help but wonder, was he really just a regular human, or was there something more to him than they could see? Finally, after what seemed like hours, the human stood back and looked at his work. The shelter was complete. It wasn't much, but it would provide the human with some protection from the brutal conditions. The alien team remained hidden, still watching from a distance. They had learned a valuable lesson today. Never underestimate a Deathworlder. But even as they marveled at the human's skill, they knew this was only the beginning. What would the human do next? What other surprises did he have in store for them? Zorath had a feeling this was only the start of something bigger, something they hadn't prepared for. The first challenge. The human stood in front of the shelter, his eyes scanning the horizon as the wind howled around him. The air was thick with toxic gases, and the sky above was a swirl of dark clouds. It was a world that no one could survive on for long, but the human had already done what seemed impossible. He had built a shelter in the middle of a deadly planet. The alien team, hidden in the shadows, continued to watch, their eyes fixed on the human. They were still in shock. How could he survive in a place like this? Their scanners and data systems were designed to track life signs across hundreds of worlds, and not a single species had ever adapted so quickly to a hostile environment. But the human wasn't done yet. As the day wore on, the alien team noticed that the human didn't seem content to simply sit in his shelter and wait out the storm. No, he had other plans. He had started gathering materials again. This time, he wasn't just collecting stones. He was looking for something else. The alien sensors were struggling to keep up as the human moved rapidly, pulling materials from the landscape that the team had assumed were useless. "He's looking for something," Xylor said, his voice filled with confusion. "But what?" Zorath stared at the screen, narrowing his eyes. "It's not just the shelter he's after. He's preparing for something else. But what?" Minutes passed, and the human continued his work, seemingly unfazed by the growing danger around him. The wind picked up, and the ground beneath his feet began to shake. The planet was alive with deadly activity, shifting tectonic plates, violent storms, and poisonous air that could kill in seconds. Still, the human pressed on. Then, without warning, the earth beneath him cracked open. A deep rumble echoed through the land, and a massive chasm appeared where he had been standing just moments before. The alien team watched in horror as the human stumbled but managed to catch himself before falling into the abyss. "Is he crazy?" Xylor exclaimed. "He should have been dead by now." Zorath remained silent, his eyes glued to the screen. The human didn't even seem to flinch. He took a deep breath and took a step back, calculating the next move. Then, without hesitation, he began to climb down into the chasm. "What's he doing?" Xylor asked in disbelief. "He's looking for something," Zorath replied, his voice low. "Something that could help him survive. He's not just surviving, he's adapting. And that's what makes him dangerous." The alien team watched as the human descended deeper into the chasm. They could see him moving swiftly, expertly navigating the narrow ledges and unstable ground. It was clear now. He wasn't just an ordinary human. He was something more, something they hadn't anticipated. The team's sensors picked up a strange energy reading from deep within the chasm. The human must have noticed it too, because he seemed to focus all his attention on a specific spot on the wall. He reached out and grabbed something, a glowing rock embedded in the stone. "What is that?" Xylor asked, leaning forward. "That's not something we've seen before." Zorath studied the readings. "It's a mineral, rare and possibly dangerous. But he's not just collecting it. He's using it." The human pulled the glowing rock free and examined it in his hands. With a quick motion, he crushed the mineral and sprinkled it across the ground in front of him. Then, to the alien team's surprise, the ground began to stabilize. The chasm seemed to stop moving. The shaking halted, and the wind died down. The human had found something that calmed the planet itself. "He's using the planet's energy," Zorath muttered under his breath. Xylor could hardly believe what he was seeing. But how? How does he know what to do with it? Zorath didn't have an answer, but it was becoming clearer by the second. This human wasn't just surviving. He was unlocking the secrets of this death world. As the planet's tremors finally stopped, the human climbed back up, carrying the glowing rock with him. He had found something that the alien team had missed, something that could change everything. The alien team was left in stunned silence. This human had just done something that no other species had ever done. He had faced the first of many challenges, and somehow he had come out on top. But what would he do next? What else was this world hiding? And more importantly, what would happen when the alien forces realized just how dangerous this human could be? The suspense was building. The real test was about to begin. The hidden strength. As the human emerged from the chasm, the alien team remained silent, their eyes glued to the monitor. They had been tracking him for hours, and it was becoming increasingly clear that he wasn't like any other species they had encountered. He wasn't just surviving on this death world. He was mastering it. The wind had died down after the humans' strange manipulation of the planet's energy, but the atmosphere was still thick with tension. The alien team had witnessed many species fight for survival on dangerous planets, but none of them had ever done so with such calm determination. It was as though the human was not only comfortable here, but he understood the planet in a way no one else did. The human's next move confirmed their suspicions. He began to gather more materials, this time not from the chasm, but from the barren landscape. The rocks, the minerals, and even the air itself seemed to respond to his presence. The alien team watched in awe as the human took quick, efficient steps, as though he had done this before. He didn't hesitate. Every action seemed to have a purpose. "What is he doing?" Sylar asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "He's gathering resources as though he's preparing for something." Zoreth studied the human's movements. He had seen humans do many things during their wars, but nothing like this. "He's not just gathering. He's building something," Zoreth said. "And he's doing it with ease." The alien team continued to monitor the human's progress, baffled by his skill. It was clear that the human wasn't simply surviving the planet's harsh conditions. He was thriving. As the hours passed, the human had begun constructing something large, something that seemed to defy the very nature of the planet. He wasn't just making a shelter anymore. He was making a structure. The alien team's confusion grew deeper as the human continued to work. He used materials that the team had considered useless, rocks that were too fragile, minerals that emitted dangerous radiation, and even the toxic air were all being repurposed into something new. "What is that?" Sylar asked, pointing at the structure. The human had built what looked like a large, dome-shaped structure, something that could protect against the planet's most dangerous elements. Zoreth leaned closer to the screen. "He's building a fortress," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Not just a shelter, a fortress." The human worked tirelessly, moving with purpose and precision. There was no sign of fear in his actions. His hands were steady as he used the minerals and rocks to reinforce the walls of the structure. With each move, it became clearer that the human had a plan. He wasn't just improvising. He was constructing something that would allow him to survive for much longer than any of them had anticipated. As the alien team watched in silence, the human's work came to an end. The fortress was complete. The alien team's instruments could now detect an energy signature coming from the structure. The human had harnessed the planet's energy once again, and this time he had created a powerful shield around his new fortress. "I've never seen anything like it," Sylar said, his voice barely above a whisper. Zoreth remained silent, his mind racing. The human had done the impossible. He had tamed a deadly planet. But what would happen next? The team's sensors were still tracking the human's movements. He had entered the fortress, and the structure was now fully operational, sending out waves of energy that pushed back the harsh environment. It was clear that the human had something that the aliens didn't understand. This planet was no longer a death world to him. It was a challenge he had conquered. But the most chilling realization of all came from Zoreth's thoughts. If this human could conquer a planet like this, what would stop him from doing the same to other worlds? The aliens had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. The stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. "What now?" Sylar asked, his eyes wide with fear. Zoreth looked at the screen, his expression grim. Now, we wait. The real challenge begins. The alien team knew that they were no longer dealing with a simple survivor. They were facing a force that could reshape the entire galaxy. And that was only the beginning. The alien response. As the humans' fortress stood firm against the deadly world's unforgiving environment, the alien team was left with no choice but to reconsider everything they had assumed about Deathworlders. The alien agents had encountered humans before, but never in such a dire, uninhabitable environment. The strength, intelligence, and resilience the human demonstrated were beyond anything they had expected. The fortress he had built was no mere shelter. It was a symbol of his adaptability and skill. In their control room, the alien team gathered, their faces grim as they studied the human shelter from their high-tech monitors. The fortress continued to emit energy, its pulse radiating across the planet. There was no doubt now, this human was not just surviving the planet. He was controlling it. The wind had picked up again, howling like a beast, but the fortress stood against it, untouched. "What are we dealing with here?" Siler's voice trembled as he looked at Zorath. He couldn't believe the footage before him. This human, he's turning the planet into his advantage. And we can't even touch him. Zorath's eyes narrowed as he continued to watch the human through the screen. He had been observing the human's every move, trying to understand his methods, but there was one thing he could not understand: the human's motivation. What drove him to survive in such conditions? Why did he insist on staying on this planet when it seemed so futile to anyone else? It's not just about survival for him. Zorath finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. This is about proving something. He's not just fighting against the planet. He's fighting against us. Thylor blinked in surprise. "You mean he knows we're watching him?" Zorath nodded. "I don't know, but he has to. No one survives this long on a death world without learning to adapt. And the fact that he's managed to build this fortress, this stronghold, means he's planning something. We have underestimated him, Tyler. That is a mistake we cannot afford to repeat." The team fell into a tense silence. They had gathered the best minds from across the galaxy to deal with this situation. But none of them had foreseen that a lone human could turn a world designed to kill him into his own advantage. Every moment that passed, the human's power seemed to grow. Meanwhile, on the planet's surface, the human rested inside his shelter, watching the storm rage outside. His face, once wary from the harsh conditions, now showed a glimmer of something else: satisfaction. The structure he had built was more than just protection. It was a statement, one that no one, not even the aliens, could ignore. He had already started to prepare for what was to come. His actions weren't just out of survival instinct. They were deliberate. Each step had been calculated to send a message that Deathworlders, especially humans, could never be underestimated. The human had built a shelter using materials that would have been considered useless or impossible to use by most species. Rocks that radiated extreme heat, poisonous gases, and minerals capable of tearing down structures. None of it fazed him. The human had found a way to bend the death world to his will. But now, the world was beginning to feel the weight of his presence. Inside the fortress, the human worked tirelessly. His focus was unwavering, even as the planet raged outside his sanctuary. He gathered more resources, tinkered with his equipment, and set up systems within the shelter to ensure its survival. For the first time since he had arrived on this death world, he allowed himself a moment of peace, but this peace was only temporary. The aliens would come, and when they did, they would realize what they had awakened: the true power of a Deathworlder. Back in the alien control room, the team continued to monitor the human's every movement as they attempted to devise a plan to deal with him. They had never encountered a being like this before, one who not only survived, but thrived on the most dangerous planet they had ever known. "Zorath," Silor spoke hesitantly, breaking the silence. "Do you think he knows we're watching? Do you think he'll attack?" Zorath looked over at Silor, his eyes narrowing as he mulled over the possibility. I don't know, but if he does attack, we won't be ready. The alien team was left with a stark realization. They were no longer the ones in control. The human had flipped the narrative, and now they had to decide how to proceed. They could either risk provoking a fight they might not win, or try to negotiate with a being who had proven that negotiation was not his first priority. But one thing was certain: the human was not a prisoner. He was a force in his own right, and the galaxy had yet to understand the full extent of his power. The challenge begins. The storm outside raged with a violent intensity, but within the human shelter, there was an eerie calm. The alien team continued to monitor the situation from their command center, their faces tense and their minds racing to understand the full extent of the humans' capabilities. The realization had hit them hard. They were facing an adversary unlike anything they had ever encountered before. Zoreth sat at the control panel, his hands hovering over the buttons, his eyes locked onto the footage of the human. "He's planning something," Zoreth murmured, more to himself than to his team. "He's not just surviving anymore, he's preparing for the next phase." Xylor, who had been silent for a long while, spoke up with an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "What do we do now? He's turning our whole strategy upside down. What if we provoke him?" Zoreth leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Provoking him might be exactly what he wants. A human who's survived on a death world has instincts sharper than anything we can predict. The question now isn't whether we provoke him. It's whether we can outsmart him. Back on the planet's surface, the human remained calm inside his shelter. He had completed his initial work, reinforcing the structure and securing his supplies. But there was more to it than just surviving. The human had begun setting traps, not just for the harsh environment, but for the aliens themselves. The human's mind was a maze of ideas and strategies. He understood that survival on a death world wasn't about brute force. It was about using your environment to your advantage. He had spent days observing the alien ships that hovered far above the planet's surface, analyzing their movements, their technology, and their weaknesses. Now he had a plan, a dangerous, calculated plan. The human took a deep breath as he prepared his equipment, tools, materials, and some devices he had scavenged from the wreckage of previous expeditions. Every piece had been carefully chosen for a specific purpose. Nothing was wasted. Every resource had to serve a goal. His heart raced as he looked over his makeshift map, plotting his next move. With swift movements, he secured a small beacon, a low-tech device that could transmit a signal far beyond the atmosphere of the planet. The aliens wouldn't notice it immediately, but in time, the signal would alert them that he was prepared, ready to play their game. He activated the beacon, watching it glow faintly, and stepped back. A small grin tugged at the corners of his mouth. He knew the aliens were watching. They would be forced to respond soon, and that was exactly what he needed. A challenge. A test. Meanwhile, the alien team watched in silence as the beacon blinked to life on their screens. Xylor's voice broke the silence. "What is he doing? This isn't just survival. This is something more." Zoreth's eyes narrowed as he zoomed in on the signal. This is his message to us. He knows we're watching, and he's daring us to engage. The tension in the room grew thicker. The alien team was now faced with a difficult choice: engage the human directly and risk underestimating him again, or attempt to confront him with an entirely new strategy. The problem was, there was no strategy they had that could guarantee success. Not against an opponent who seemed to always be one step ahead. "What if he's baiting us into a trap?" Xylor suggested, his voice uneasy. "He could be waiting for us to make the first move. What if we fall right into his plan?" Zoreth looked at the screen, his eyes cold and calculating. "That's exactly what he wants us to think. But what if we're the ones being baited into believing he's setting a trap when he's really just playing a game he knows he can win?" The realization hit them all at once. This human wasn't just fighting for survival. He was playing a high-stakes game, and the aliens were his unwitting players. Back in the shelter, the human couldn't help but smile to himself as he watched the beacon signal slowly reach the aliens. He had no illusions about what was coming next. The aliens would retaliate. They would come down, send in their teams, and try to capture him. But he was ready. He had the upper hand. For the first time since his arrival on the Deathworld, he felt truly alive. His surroundings no longer seemed like a hostile environment, but a chessboard, one that he controlled. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was taking back control, and the aliens were about to find out how far he was willing to go to prove that he was more than a mere survivor. With every calculated move, the human's confidence grew. He had built his shelter, yes, but that was only the beginning. His real work had just begun. And the aliens, they were about to learn the hard way what it meant to challenge a Deathworlder. The final confrontation. The air on the desolate planet had grown thick with tension. Both the aliens and the human knew that the time for games was over. The beacon the human had sent out had triggered a chain of events that now led to the inevitable, a final confrontation between the two forces. Above, the alien ships hovered ominously, their sleek, metallic forms casting shadows over the rocky terrain below. The human had known this moment was coming. He could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was about proving that, despite all odds, humanity had a place in this galaxy. That even on a Deathworld, a human could survive, adapt, and conquer. Inside the human's shelter, he made his final preparations. His tools and weapons were neatly arranged. The shelter, though simple, had become a fortress, every corner reinforced, every opening carefully monitored. Outside, the landscape had already begun to change. The alien forces had landed, and they were closing in, their footsteps echoing on the barren ground. But the human didn't flinch. He had expected this. "Let them come," he muttered under his breath, his hand steady as he checked his gear. "Let them see what a real fight looks like." The aliens, led by Zoreth, had no idea what they were walking into. They had underestimated him from the very beginning, saw him as just another survivor on a hostile planet. They thought they could simply land, overpower him, and leave with no consequences. But what they didn't realize was that the human had been playing a different game all along, a game they had no way of understanding. As the aliens approached the shelter, they began to notice strange things. The ground beneath their feet was more unstable than it should be, and the air had an unnatural stillness to it. Zoreth's team spread out, wary of any tricks. The human was nowhere to be seen, and the shelter appeared abandoned. It was eerily quiet. Suddenly, without warning, the ground beneath them erupted. One by one, alien soldiers were caught in the traps the human had meticulously set. Hidden pits, falling nets, and even strange devices that emitted high-pitched sounds, disorienting them. Zoreth's team staggered, struggling to regain their composure as the human's voice rang out over the comms. "You should have run when you had the chance." The words were cold, calculated, and full of menace. Zoreth's eyes narrowed, realizing the depth of his mistake. The human wasn't just a survivor. He was a hunter. From the shadows, the human emerged. He was no longer just the scared, isolated being who had crash-landed on this deadly world. Now he was a force to be reckoned with, moving through the terrain with the same ease and grace that had kept him alive for so long. "You came here thinking you could conquer me, but this world has taught me one thing," the human said, his voice low but strong. "The strong don't survive on a Deathworld. The smart ones do." Zoreth's team attempted to regroup, but the human was already a step ahead. He had prepared for every possible scenario, using the terrain, the weather, and even the alien technology he had scavenged to his advantage. Each move was calculated, each trap carefully placed. The aliens had no chance. They were outmatched and outwitted. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about sending a message. The human knew that the galaxy was watching. They would remember what had happened here on this desolate, forgotten world. They would remember how a lone human had taken on an entire alien force and made them question everything they knew about power and dominance. As the final alien soldiers fell one by one, Zorith was left standing alone, watching the human with a mix of disbelief and fear. The human had turned the tables in a way no one had anticipated. They had thought they were the ones in control, but they had been wrong. The human approached Zorith, his steps slow but purposeful. "This is what happens when you underestimate a Deathworlder. We don't need your pity or your protection. We can take care of ourselves." Zorith, bruised and battered, looked up at the human, his expression one of begrudging respect. You're not like any species we've ever encountered. We thought you were weak, but now I see the truth." The human didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered loud and clear. This was his world now, and anyone who thought they could take it from him would face the same fate. With one final glance at the defeated alien leader, the human turned and walked back toward his shelter. The galaxy would have to reckon with the fact that Deathworlders were not to be underestimated, and as the storm clouds gathered above, the human knew that this was only the beginning. There were more challenges ahead, more lessons to teach, and more enemies to face. But for now, he had won. He had proven his place in the galaxy, and he would not be forgotten.